Fans of Sherlock Holmes on the radio are familiar with the iconic Basil Rathbone Nigel Bruce series of the late 1930s and 40s. What you may not know is that Edith Meiser came personally recommended by Basil Rathbone to write that program.
He had previously met Edith Meiser, and he had said to her at the time, "I'd love to work on a radio show with you."
That's Ian Dickerson, and his knowledge of those early days of Sherlock Holmes on the radio is profound. So profound, in fact, that he has unearthed the lost scripts of some of those radio shows. At one point, Meiser was replaced with two writers, Bruce Taylor and Dennis Green. Now, Bruce Taylor was actually Leslie Charteris, creator of The Saint. And that's where Ian's other passion came in.
I knew Leslie Charteris for many years, and when he died I got to know his widow fairly well. Over the years she'd hinted that there was something to do with Sherlock Holmes in Dublin.
And there the chase to find the lost radio scripts of Sherlock Holmes begins. Ian takes us on this journey back to the 1940s and describes the process by which the author of The Saint came to co-write the Sherlock Holmes radio program. And Ian isn't done. He let us know some great news for fans of old-time Sherlock Holmes radio.
And that is that I have just sent my publisher an 80,000-word history of Sherlock Holmes on the radio.
That's a tale for another time. So grab a glass of Petri wine or a cup of G. Washington coffee, pull up a chair, and join us for another exciting adventure of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com. And the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Subscriptions available at bakerstreetjournal.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 136. Sherlock Holmes, the Lost Radio Scripts.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello once again, and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And once again, we welcome you into our bosom. We hug you tightly. Just coming off of the Baker Street Irregulars weekend, which happened in New York from the 10th through the 14th. How was it, Bert?
Oh, it was unbelievably good. So many wonderful things. They closed Rockefeller Center, and the Mormon Tabernacle Choir did a fabulous 90-minute program of all of the songs written about Sherlock Holmes over the years. Unfortunately, because of copyright restrictions, we were unable to make a recording, and indeed have treated that entire event as private and secret.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Well, I'll tell you, I'm really looking forward to next year when it's rumored that the Rockettes will show up at the BSI dinner.
Oh, they were actually rehearsing the Irene Adler number, sort of trying to work out some of the tap steps at the cocktail party.
Well, unfortunately, I wasn't able to join you and the rest of the crew this year. It's the first time I've had to miss it since 1995. So my heart was there, but my body and mind were not. So
well, that happens. You know, sometimes things get in the way. Over the years, I've missed three. I missed the one in which I was invested, actually, or made an invested member of the Baker Street Irregulars because of I think it was because of a snowstorm. There was a blizzard. I just couldn't get there.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, it happens.
It does
happen. But one of the things that we did want to share with folks before we get into our interview here is our friends at Wessex Press debuted a number of new titles.
Citizens of the ancient Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Wessex won't support the return of the Burgle Hidage, King Alfred's taxation system. Apparently, nobody wants to pay for fortress repair. They have forgotten the lessons of history, but you haven't. That's why you will want copies of 3 books, new for 2018 from our WessexPress.com. House of the Doomed, a new adventure of Sherlock Holmes by Dan Andriacco. Baker Street Reveries, new Sherlockian essays by Leslie S. Klinger, and 70 Years by Gaslamp, the illustrious client's 6th casebook, edited by Marianne Bradley, Louise Haskett, and Melanie Hoffman. There's a certain slant of light on winter afternoons that oppresses like the heft of old cathedral tunes. But you can banish winter's gloom with the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
And that is encouraging to hear. There's so much going on over at the Wessex Press site, WessexPress.com. If you go through the back catalog, if you look at the new stuff, there's plenty to keep you entertained and enlightened through their tomes. Well,
sure, tomes about Holmes. How about that? There's
Holmes
a great
tomes.
slogan.
There we go. Well, a super secret here at the end of the program. You have to stay tuned because we have a contest. This is something that we will be doing on every episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, and it is only available to those listeners who participate in Patreon. As you know, Patreon is the system, or PayPal, the system that we use for support for the show. Folks that give to us on an ongoing basis as kind of a subscription, NPR style, will be eligible to participate in this contest. So stay tuned at the end of the show for what you need to do and how you need to answer in order to qualify to win. In the meantime, we are delighted to welcome to the show Ian Dickerson, who is an individual who has edited a new book called Sherlock Holmes, The Lost Radio Scripts. We'll certainly have a link to the book, how to purchase it, and all things related to this conversation in the show notes, which are available at ihose.co/ihose136. All lowercase, ihose.co/ihose136. Now, Ian has brought a lifetime love of someone related to the Sherlock Holmes stories, and certainly we'll discuss that overlap in just a moment. The Lost Radio Scripts looks at some of those 1940s productions with Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, and exactly why they're lost and how they got into our hands now. Ian will tell us all about it. Ian Dickerson, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So as we ask all of our guests on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, when and where did you first meet Mr. Sherlock Holmes?
I must have been about, age 13 or 14, and for the sake of whatever dignity I have left, I won't mention quite when that was. And I have two older brothers. One of them had a reprint of, I think it was the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And as was my way, being the younger brother, I appropriated the book and had a jolly good time reading it and thought, I wonder if there are any more. And discovered there were quite a few more, so read all those stories. Now, it didn't grab me quite the way Sherlock Holmes has grabbed many other people, and indeed probably many of your listeners, because a couple of years prior to discovering Sherlock Holmes, I also discovered Simon Templar, the Saint. Now, I don't know if you guys have read any of the original Saint books, but there's a certain style and joie de vivre about those books that I discovered at the right time, in the right place. So for me, it was all about the Saint. Then I discovered Sherlock Holmes, and over a few years, I read the stories. The BBC were then showing on a fairly regular basis the Rathbone and Bruce films, and I watched those quite happily, thoroughly enjoyed them. Watched the Jeremy Brett series when that materialised later in the 80s. But for me, I'm afraid it was all about the Saint, really.
Well, that's not unusual, Ian. Many of us go through all the great mystery characters along with or after or during our discovery of Sherlock Holmes, and I too read all the Saint novels. But, that answers a question, because when I was looking at the Lost Radio scripts, one of the things that struck me is in your introduction, Sherlock Holmes on the Air, which is not huge. It's not a huge introduction. I was surprised and delighted to discover 5 or 6 or 7 things I didn't know about this cast of characters: Nigel Bruce, Leslie Charteris, Basil Rathbone, and I was very curious how you how you acquired some of this information, or where your reading had taken you that had exposed you to this. And now that explains something. That's fascinating.
Good. I must admit, I agree with you. That introduction is far too short, but there's a very good reason for that. And that is that I have just sent my publisher basically an 80,000 word history of Sherlock Holmes on the radio, which is, it covers all aspects of Holmes on American radio from 1922 through to the Gielgud series as well.
So along with your interest in Leslie Charteris and the Saint, which I want to get back to, how deep was your interest in Holmes? Did this become a major passion for you on an equal par with the Saint, or is it something that's just, or was your interest more in radio?
It's a combination of things, really. I think book-wise, I regularly dipped in and out of the original stories over the years. Thoroughly enjoyed them, and it never really, I don't know, I never really went so far as to discover any of the pastiches or any of the continuation novels or whatever else. I've always loved radio drama. I've always loved old-time radio drama. So when I discovered that Rathbone and Bruce did an awful lot of radio shows as Holmes and Watson, over the years, as the internet matured and everything like that, I found those shows and I listened to them and I thoroughly loved them. And yes, as new films, new productions and stuff came along, I've kept up fairly regularly with it, but it's never really consumed me quite the way that Simon Templar did.
We know that those early programs were penned by Edith Meiser, who was widely acclaimed in her time. And the Baker Street Irregulars even recognized her in later years and in her contributions to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Can you take us through the development of the writing staff and maybe some of the production changes and kind of that timeline between the late 1930s and mid-1940s that led up to what the Lost Scripts actually covers?
Sure. Firstly, though, I must say I think you're right about Edith Meiser. When I was doing all the research for the book and everything, I obviously looked a fair degree into her life, and it's a fascinating life. She was a fascinating person, and I'd love to see a full biography of her one of these days, because the way she balanced the writing and the acting and everything else in her life was just completely fascinating. But basically, I think the story really started with his lost script in 1939 when Basil Rathbone was cast as Sherlock Holmes in the films. He had previously met Edith Meiser, from what I can tell, it was about the previous year, 1938, and he had said to her at the time, "I'd love to work on a radio show with you." When the first Rathbone Sherlock Holmes film was released and became very popular, it seemed like the opportunity was ripe to relaunch Sherlock Holmes on the radio. And Edith Meiser took that opportunity and grasped it with both hands, launching Rathbone and Bruce as Holmes in 1939 on a weekly radio show, which must have been quite entertaining because they were doing the films during the week and starring as Holmes and Watson on the radio at the weekend. That continued for, what we are now, probably 3 or 4 years. But Edith Meiser had always had this interest in maintaining more than one career. She loved her writing. At one stage I found a lovely newspaper article which described how she had 6 different typewriters on the go in her study, each one of which had a page for a different script in as she was writing them. But she also loved to act, and she loved the musicals and everything as well. And that began to take its toll on her contribution to the radio shows, and the productions found themselves reusing scripts that they'd used previously. And this came to the sponsors' attention, Petri Wine, and they weren't terribly happy about it. This all came to a point where, well, it depends on which particular reports you believe. Edith Meiser either quit or was fired. Given that she, at some stage, considered suing the sponsors and the Conan Doyle estate over her departure, it wasn't an entirely amicable departure, clearly. But nevertheless, she was let go from the show. At the same time, the sponsor's agency, Young and Rubicon, brought on a new producer, Glenn Hall Taylor, who I don't know for sure, but I suspect might have been the instigator of her departure. He was then tasked with finding a replacement to write the show. He was good friends with a chap called Dennis Green, who was an English actor and writer, and offered him the job. Dennis Green was keen to do it, but realised that whilst he could write dialogue, he wasn't very good at plotting. So he turned to his good friend Leslie Charteris and said, "Could you give me a hand?" Charteris at the time was looking to launch The Saint on the radio, but he was also never shy about taking jobs if he could earn money from them. So he said, "Yeah, absolutely. If I come up with plots, you can write the dialogue," and away we go. And he thought, well, if I'm trying to launch a Saint on the radio, I don't really want my name to be attached to Sherlock Holmes as well, because it'd be working for the competition. So he adopted the pseudonym of Bruce Taylor, taking Nigel Bruce's surname and Glenn Hall Taylor's surname. And they launched, and for about 9 months or so, they had a fairly good script writing partnership together. But eventually, Leslie's other commitments began to take priority, and he left the show.
And what year was that?
He left in 1945. Their first show aired in the autumn of 1944.
Okay. So he was there about a year or so.
Roughly, yeah.
Okay. And then when he came in, that's when, who is it, Anthony Boucher replaced him?
Correct, yeah. I mean, Boucher had expressed an interest to Dennis Green and indirectly to Leslie about working for Leslie, because Leslie at the time was trying to launch himself as a multimedia producer, for want of a better phrase. He'd launched his own production company, and he was at the time looking to launch a Saint magazine, probably not similar to the one that was actually launched in 1953. And Anthony Boucher had his arms up and said, "I'll edit it, please let me edit it, I've got a good track record." That never came off, but in the end, as we know, he replaced him on the radio show.
Now, the Saint was, obviously it had many iterations, obviously the novels, but many people may know of the television program, The Saint, with, of course, Roger Moore, who has his own connections to Sherlock Holmes. But there was also a radio program around the same time in the 1940s. Was Leslie Charteris involved in that radio program?
Very much so, and this is one of the key reasons why he left the Holmes show, because in January 1945, The Saint launched on NBC Radio with Edgar Barrier in the leading role. The show itself and the first incarnation of it only ran for 13 weeks, was produced by Saint Radio Productions, which was Leslie Charteris. He produced, he oversaw the writing, and he directed some of the shows as well.
And who played the title role in that series?
In the first series, it was Edgar Barrier, the movie actor. Okay. The second series that followed it in July 1945, it was Brian Aherne.
These stories, we've got the book, The Lost Radio Scripts of Sherlock Holmes. First of all, why were they lost?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of old-time radio, back in the 1940s particularly, no one could ever really envisage an afterlife for the old-time radio shows they were making. No one ever, dreamed in their wildest dreams of CD recordings. The internet was a light year away. It was done and dusted. So, only rarely, or when the show was sold to other stations, were the shows recorded on disc or transcriptions. And these shows, for some reason, were never kept. A lot of these shows before this time were sporadically kept. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, most of the surviving Sherlock Holmes dramas that are kept are from the Boucher Green years onwards. As I say, there are a few dotted around. I've got some of the 1930s shows as well on my computer, which are fascinating listening. But yeah, like so many radio shows, examples of this period don't exist. And for many years, I had a list of episode titles that I knew Leslie had written, but I had no idea what the episodes were about, or anything else about them.
So, Ian, when you say lost or the episodes are missing, are you referring to the fact that we can't hear these particular episodes of the shows, that there are no recordings extant of them?
I believe one or two recordings may survive, but they're very hard to get hold of. But yes, in essence, yeah, you cannot listen to these shows at all. And as I say, for many years, you couldn't even read the scripts of them.
For those of our listeners who might not be familiar with this particular period, could you just give us a minute or two about how these programs were actually distributed and why sometimes even now in the 21st century recordings occasionally pop up? Because this, of course, was, as you point out, the days before digital, days before tape.
Sure. I mean, I think what's key to understand here is that the sponsor drove these shows because they were paying for them. So, the sponsor clearly wanted to get as much airtime as possible, also wanted to get a return on their investment. So sales of these shows were key, and the best way for these shows to be sold was using transcription discs, recorded on effectively old-fashioned records, for want of a better phrase, which would then be sent to the relevant stations who could broadcast those shows. As I said earlier, some of those discs were kept, some of those discs were not kept because no one really envisaged what they'd do with them, and they were taking up space. Fortunately, those discs that survive have, found themselves into, shall we say, the digital era, and are available for download in various places.
So as I remember, not because I was there, but as I remember from my reading about that process, basically they would record the shows, make a master, and then produce these, as you described them, transcription discs, which they would send out to the stations. And depending on the show or depending on the network, the idea was either that you would send the recording back or you would throw it away. And over the years, sometimes people disposed of it. Sometimes they took it home. Sometimes it went to a garage. Sometimes they put it in a box and forgot about it. And that's why some of these things pop up occasionally. Is that about it?
I think that sums it up quite nicely.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So, it's interesting to remember a time when the sponsors were in so much control of the content on radio. So who was it who first decided, which company first decided that it would be a great thing to have Sherlock Holmes on the radio and have the name of their company associated with it?
Well, I think perhaps the best example is the first series sponsor for the show, which was in 1930, which was G. Washington Coffee, which was a then fairly new instant coffee brand. And what I only discovered when I researched my history of Holmes on the Radio book is that instant coffee then in 1930 was a fairly new invention. And these instant coffee producers had remarkably struggled to get people to understand that by pouring boiling hot water on these crystals, you could get a really nice drink out of it. That sheer process of instant coffee just wasn't getting across to their market. And it so happened that the key people in G. Washington's coffee were Sherlock Holmes fans as well. So when Edith Meiser approached them, they said, yeah, what a great opportunity. And they sponsored it for many years.
So was this originally Edith Meiser's idea?
Which part in particular? Putting Sherlock Holmes on the radio?
Yeah.
Absolutely. She was a Holmes fan from the age of 13 and had, as a sort of, when she was at Vassar, she had acted and she'd written in plays and stuff. So she'd always kind of had this double career going. And she married Tom McKnight, who had also established himself as a writer and producer. And when the Depression came and live theatre took a great shock, they set themselves up as radio producers. And they thought, wouldn't it be great? They saw William Gillette as Holmes on the stage and thought it would make a great radio show.
You know, you're very right about George Washington Coffee, connected with some other research, completely unconnected to all of this. I recently discovered the advertising and launch processes around G. Washington Coffee in the 1920s or in the early part of the 20th century. And the name in the States, you know, we would think that someone has decided it's a grand idea just to call this after George Washington. But in fact, as I found out in my research, that's not true. The G. Washington was the fellow who actually invented this particular process, and he was a British descendant of George Washington, who had developed, among other things, a very high-performing kerosene lamp, and who had apparently spent 14 years developing this coffee refining process so that he could create these instant crystals. And then it was the challenge was then demonstrating it to people and taking it to hotels and to shows and sending out samples and convincing the retailers to do something with it. And the salesman would show up. I mean, this has got nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes, but the salesman would show up at the offices of the people who bought products for the supermarkets or the groceries with vacuum bottles of hot water and cups, and they would say, look, here's how it works. and the whole point was convenience, but it took, years for instant coffee to become accepted by consumers because it was a puzzle to them.
I know, it's funny, it's something that we've always taken, well, certainly I've taken for granted, I don't know about you chaps, but you never realised quite what the struggle was, and it's fascinating when you listen to those early 1930s shows that, some of which still exist, when you hear, Meiser hit on this wonderful idea of having Dr. Watson narrate the stories, having the show's narrator approach Dr. Watson and say, come and tell us a story, Dr. Watson. In those early 1930s shows, the narrator arrives at Dr. Watson's house, and Dr. Watson, in great detail, describes how he's going to make a fresh cup of lovely G. Washington coffee for the narrator. A spoonful in my mug, spoonful in your mug, now pour on the hot water. And I tell you, I must have about a dozen of those shows, and after I listened to about 6 of them on the trot, I was going mad with that, that painful description of how to make an instant cup of coffee. But people just didn't grasp it.
Mm. Now, did it drive you to actually buy a container of instant coffee because sometimes I must say when I listen to all of these old advertisements for Pepsodent toothpaste on old radio programs and even Petri wine, while I am not about to go looking for Petri wine, I always say to myself, a glass of Petri wine really wouldn't be bad at this point.
You know what? I'm a coffee drinker anyway, so yeah, trust me, a lot of coffee was consumed in the making of these books. But Petri wine, I've typed up so many adverts of Petri wine who took time to bring you good wine. Now, I understand from people that it wasn't the best wine in the world, but God, I could have sunk several bottles of it after doing those books.
Well, it's the power of advertising.
Absolutely.
So before we talk more about some of these shows, how did you unearth all of this information and how did you actually find these scripts?
I knew Leslie Charteris for many years, and when he died, I got to know his widow fairly well. And she passed away in 2014, and his family asked me to basically clear out the flat that they've maintained in Dublin. They lived in the UK, but they had a flat in Dublin. And when we went over there was a large pile of radio scripts in his office, which I dived straight into. And these were probably making up about half the pile of those scripts.
Well, what was on the top of the pile? What did you think when you saw all this?
Oh, my eyes lit up. My wife will tell you how my eyes can light up when I see something like that. I over the years, I knew Audrey, his widow. She'd hinted that there was something to do with Sherlock Holmes in Dublin. But she was a very private lady, so I could never quite get over there. And to be honest, when we walked in the flat, I'd forgotten that there might be something there. So really, I just went straight to them, went straight through them, went, my goodness me, there's an awful lot of Sherlock Holmes scripts here. There was an awful lot of Saint scripts and other scripts there as well. But it was the Sherlock Holmes ones that grabbed me, because as I say, for years, and I was 8 or 9 years old when I first discovered the Saint. I must have been 12 or 13 when I knew Leslie wrote Sherlock Holmes. So for a good 30 years or so, I knew Leslie had written some Sherlock Holmes stories, but I had no idea what they were. And I finally discovered them.
So the book gives us 12 of these cases. The Adventure of the African Leopard Men, The Story of the Temple of the lovely titles, The Story of the Temple of Demetrius, The Weird Case of the Guardian of the Dead, The Unusual Story of the Invisible Necklace, The Strange Case of the Third Hunchback, and so on. They're just lovely titles. Tell us a little bit about this. First of all, are there more? Is it possible that there'll be a volume 2? But second, tell us about some of these stories and what stands out to you.
Well, hopefully there'll be more. I have sent another 14 of them to my publisher. And last time we spoke about it, he was hoping to publish them this spring. Clearly it depends on sales of the first volume, but I'm fairly hopeful it'll do that. On top of those 14, I do have another 8 scripts sitting by my side as I talk. I'm not entirely sure what will become of those. I don't know. It doesn't really make a substantial book if I collect them up and make them a third volume. We'll see. I'm open to suggestions.
And what about performing some of them? Have you had done any readings, or have thought at all about getting them actually recorded and played?
Personally, I haven't done any readings because I am painfully shy and retiring, as you can tell. I have had conversations with various audio producers, including some who work for the BBC, and those conversations are ongoing.
Good. Well, tell us about the cases. What stands out to you in the scripts as an authority on Charteris and an enthusiast of Holmes? Which of these stories do you think shows either one of these gents at their best?
I think perhaps the best way of starting this is by saying that, there are, 26 scripts altogether that I've given to my publisher. And in typing these up, I was fairly well focused on typing these up, but some of them got typed up a lot quicker than others because some of them were, predictable. Some of them were, you knew who'd done it from the moment they set up the situation. Other ones, I just love the scenery and the environment. There's one, Murder Under the Big Top, which is set in a circus, as you might have gathered, and it's a murder in a circus, and the murder plot itself isn't, it's okay, it works, but it's the whole imagery for me of, Rathbone and Bruce's Holmes and Watson in at the circus, having a bit of fun, and it's all there running in my head as if it was one of those films on TV. So for me, that sort of thing really works. I love that story. Now, the funny thing about that one is Boucher and Green had an episode that ran, I think, in 1946, which is called The Indiscretion of Mr. Edwards. And the opening is very, very similar to Murder Under the Big Top. Other stories that intrigue me, The Strange Story of the Temple of Demetrius. That's one of those stories where, when you get into it, you can see where it's going, you can see where it's heading, but again, it's the fun with the characters and the dialogue, and it is, it's like like a short film starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce as Holmes and Watson.
With the the scripts that are published now, which I must say are really fascinating, and the backstory that you've given about Charteris, the connections, the backstory about Edith Meiser, the visualization, the imprint, the invisible imprint of Holmes and Watson as Rathbone and Bruce is fascinating. What's in, it's from my back of the envelope math, there are 34 scripts. There are a dozen here, and you've sent some more off, and then there are eight left over. Are there any treasures, that stand out to you that we can look forward to in the other episodes?
Yeah, I mean, there's ones here called, I should perhaps point out in the second volume that 3 of the stories are incomplete. One script is missing, I think it's the last 2 or 3 pages, and the other 2 scripts are missing, oddly enough, both scripts are missing page 8. But they are flagged as incomplete in the second volume, and you'll see that. The second volume in particular, there's the Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, and you can guess what that's based on. It's not an original story. The title's very recognisable. There's one called The Play's the Thing, which I have a suspicion was written to indulge Basil Rathbone's love of Shakespeare. But again, it's set in a theatre, and it's good fun, and it works a treat. There's also one there called The Strange Adventure of the Doomed Sextet. Now, for whatever reason, I can't figure it out, but the title had always caught my eye, and I wondered what it was about. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but it is very much worth reading.
Oh, it's a shame that some of them are incomplete, but that will be in the second volume.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. For those of our listeners who might also have an interest in the Saint, can you give us a little sketch of Leslie Charteris?
Sure. I'm not sure I can do it a little sketch. I've written his biography, and it's quite long. Leslie was born in 1907 in Singapore. His father was a Chinese doctor. His mother was an English lady. That time of life in the early 20th century, Singapore was quite rife with racism, and Leslie, being Anglo-Chinese, didn't fare too well on that score, because the local Chinese would say, "Your mother's English, I don't want to play with you." The local English, what few local English there were there, said, "Your father's Chinese, don't want to know you." His parents split up when he was 12. His mother brought him and his younger brother to England, where he was enrolled in school. He found his way to Cambridge University, where he quit after a year because he wanted to be a writer. He had, in fact, always wanted to be a writer since about the age of 7. His first poem was published in the Straits Times, which was one of the preeminent Singapore newspapers, when he was just aged 9. And he had always written. At one stage, he wrote, as is the way with children, and I did it myself, when he was about 7 or 8, he produced his own magazine on his own typewriter. He wrote his own stories there, and for illustrations, he wrote a little comic strip which featured stick men and women, and probably gave rise to the Sign of the Saint in later years. So he quit Cambridge, wanting to become a writer, and struggled greatly. It was 1926, it was the time of the Great Depression. He did a number of jobs, all of which would end up providing useful background material for stories, but he continued writing. His first novel was published 26, and he soon had a 3-book contract with publishers Wardlock & Co., who I was fascinated to discover had published their fair share of Holmes adventures. One of those stories, his first 5 books all featured different characters, but one of them featured the Saint. After a while, he got fed up of having to struggle to invent new heroes, so he returned to the Saint. He was hired to write short stories for a new thriller magazine in the UK called, oddly enough, Thriller. And for many weeks he wrote lots of Saint short stories for that, becoming very good friends with its editor, Monty Hayden, who would at least steer him in terms of subject matter, if not help him in terms of stories. Eventually, lots of those short stories were collected into books, and Hodder and Stoughton became his publishers and published to great acclaim many of those early stories that appeared in Thriller. His first, well, I hesitate to say breakthrough novel because it was very popular in England, but his first international bestseller was The Saint in New York, which was published in 1935. It was, I think, the 15th Saint novel. He'd always had a fascination with America, having visited it several times, and eventually in the late 1930s he moved over there, lock, stock and barrel. He had a spell writing in Hollywood for a couple of years, but didn't really get on with Hollywood, so came back to the UK and continued writing Saint adventures. Several years later he returned to America and returned to Hollywood, which was a bit more successful at that time, with the Saint films in production. He wanted to oversee what was happening there. He was trying to get the Saint on the radio, as we've discussed. And he was writing. He was writing lots and lots and lots. With the advent of television in the late 1940s and 1950s, he was desperately keen to try and get the Saint on TV and spent many years trying to do that, even to the extent of writing some scripts himself. That never happened. Unfortunately, the script still survived. And it took a producer called Bob Baker into the 1960s and Lou Gray to get the Saint on TV, which again is a whole other story. And he continued writing Saint stories. He married 4 times. His last marriage lasted 40 years. His enthusiasm waxed and waned for the Saint a bit. There were times where he felt anyone really wanted from him was yet another Saint story, and he wasn't tempted to go down the route of Conan Doyle and kill off his hero, because I think he was too astute commercially to do that. But in the end, he farmed out a lot of the basic writing for Saint stories to other writers and would then perform a final edit. And the last dozen or so Saint books were collaborations, where he happily acknowledged the writers who had worked with him on those books.
That's fascinating. The days when it just shows you a path. Conan Doyle felt that Holmes obscured what he considered to be his more important work, which was basically recreating lost ages of English history, the 14th century, the 15th century, and his historical novels and other things. Charteris was, a similarly productive and gifted writer, but extended the Saint almost, I don't mean this in a disparaging way at all, but almost as a product. I mean, in a way, Charteris became the Saint industry, and the Saint became, in addition to a character, sort of a label for a class of entertainment almost. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I've used the line in my biography of him where, the Saint was an industry and he just couldn't keep up because people just wanted more and more from the Saint and he wasn't willing to do it.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your other interest here. There are 3 books of yours that I think are easily available on Amazon. One, of course, is Sherlock Holmes, The Lost Radio Scripts. And then we have your history of the Saint on the radio, but also Who is the Falcon? Tell us just a little bit about the Falcon, which is another great radio character from this same era.
I seem to have a fondness for gentleman detectives, I think it's fair to say. Again, the same sort of period where I discovered Holmes and the black and white Saint movies, the BBC would also show these films of a character called the Falcon, who was initially played by George Sanders, and my poor teenage brain went, "Oh, George Sanders, I've seen him as the Saint, he must be very good as the Falcon." And he wasn't bad, actually. He was then replaced by his brother, Tom Conway, who, oddly enough, also played the Saint on the radio, so there's a lot in common here. And Tom Conway carried it off for a dozen or so movies. And I love them. There's something about the gentleman detective that hits home with me. And I love the films, and I let it go for many years. And with the advent of the internet, I discovered there was a Falcon radio show. And when I dug further, I discovered there was a Falcon radio show that ran for nigh on 10 years. And when I started listening to them, they're completely different. they are, I don't want to be derogatory, but they're sort of fairly bog-standard American PI dramas of the period. Don't get me wrong, I love listening to them, they're great storytelling. But they're so different from the gentleman detective, particularly from the sort of English gentleman detective that George Sanders would play. And I wanted to find out why, and I wanted to find out more, and I wanted to find out how many episodes existed, and I wanted to find out the background of the people involved in making them. So I wrote a book about it.
Wow, that's excellent. Are there, this is a question that I've always been interested. Well, let me just cycle back to Holmes for a minute, and then I want to ask you another question about radio. Simon Templar. There are, let me think about how to structure the question here. Conan Doyle was heavily influenced by the stories his mother would tell him about the deeds of knight errants, about a code of honor, about noble life. And so that characterized a lot of his writing. When we look at Sherlock Holmes, particularly in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, he also has a very strong code of justice, and that's something that Scott and I have talked about off and on. Simon Templar, of course, is Simon Templar, which one could, without too much trouble, connect to the Knights Templar. So when you think of the two characters, do you see similarities between the Saint and Holmes, or differences?
I see some similarities and I see some differences. I mean, I think in terms of mental acuity and the ability to see, well, I think for the Saint, the ability to see what isn't obvious to people, and Holmes for the ability to, what he sees as obvious but other people don't see as obvious, if you understand me. There's a certain commonality there in the mental acuity to see those situations, to assess those situations and those people, and to move forward on them. There's obviously an awful lot of differences. I mean, I think a lot of the differences come from the times in which those stories were told. You know, Holmes and Watson, much as I love them, they're very, in the original stories anyway, quite straight-laced, quite restricted. The humour is not as obvious as perhaps it might be. Whereas the Saint, you know, I mean, I don't know if you've ever read any Bulldog Drummond books.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But I came to them not that long ago, actually. And they are so hard to read. Now, I don't doubt that Bulldog Drummond influenced Leslie in creating The Saint. You know, I mean, I read Bulldog Drummond books and I thought, oh, God, you know, where's the humour? Where's the joy? Where's the action-adventure? It's very, very straight. And I think that's really it. You know, The Saint was kind of his reaction to reading the likes of Bulldog Drummond. I know he read them. I know he read E. Phillips Oppenheimer and other stories where he just wanted a hero who had a bit of fun in his adventures.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the contrast. Tell us a little bit about detective shows and radio in the UK versus the States. You know, it's interesting. The advent of the internet and electronic media and so on opened up a world for you of shows that you had previously not seen. But I know from my own readings and interests that there's a lot in UK radio that's never come over to the States. Were there detective stories, things on the radio in the UK that strike you as being significant that we might not have heard of in America?
There are, and the one that springs to mind is a character called Paul Temple. Now, I don't know if you ever heard of him. He was a detective created by Francis Durbridge and ran for many years on BBC Radio, their adaptations. He was very, I mean, I guess I'm back on the gentleman detective genre again, because he was very much a sort of well-to-do gentleman detective. But the stories were very popular, and they are available on CD, and I'm sure they're available on the internet somewhere nowadays, because everything is. But they're great fun and they're great period dramas, but they don't seem to have travelled internationally. You know, I mean, what still amuses me, quite frankly, about this book is that I'm sat here in England writing books about an American radio show that was based on an English character and was written by an Anglo-Chinese Englishman and another Englishman. It's a very international stew.
Well, and that is the nice part about this enthusiasm that we have. which does cross all of these national boundaries and involves everyone. You know, we have had Bert Coules on the show and talked a little bit about the history of talked a lot actually about the history of Sherlock Holmes on radio from the very earliest days. And I do know a little bit about Paul Temple because the BBC had a series, a short-lived series, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 episodes, just on the great detectives on Radio 4, I think, which I would listen to. And one of them was Paul Temple.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating stuff. And, you know, I mean, I don't know what it is about the gentleman detective that appeals to me, that whole genre. I think it's perhaps just doing, you know, solving these puzzles, solving these crimes with a certain degree of style, and whatever that style may be, as long as it appeals to me, you know, I'm there, I'm in. And it's also, I think, very much a genre from bygone days. And I'm wondering whether that's half of my attraction to it, because you just don't see this sort of detective much anymore.
Well, it's true. Well, everything comes back, you know. I'm sure in the years ahead, I'm sure Robin Hood will be back on the silver screen. I'm sure Wild West heroes like the Lone Ranger will come back in the decades ahead. There'll be another round of interest in pirates, and I'm sure there'll be another birth of the gentleman detective and more Sherlock Holmes in the future and more Simon Templar, no doubt.
Oh, of course. In fact, there is a movie in development for the Saints as we speak. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope it's not Robert Downey Jr.
They haven't got that far as casting, but so do I.
Are there any, in your interest in Holmes on the radio, one of the things that Bert Coules pointed out to us if you look at the history of the arc of the BBC, for example, and their dramatization of the Holmes stories, is that over the years, the radio skills and talents began to develop. So the use of sound, the notion that the Moor, for example, in The Hound of Baskervilles would be a character that needs to be expressed through music and atmosphere. Are there any, in your listening of these shows or other shows, are there examples of what seem to you to be really great radio moments, great radio skills? You know, you mentioned some things that really give you the feeling of being in the action, of seeing Holmes and Watson. But are there any things that stand out to you from a production standpoint?
That's an interesting question, and at the risk of being rather dull, I don't think there's an obvious answer to me. But what it was for me, even listening to those 1930s radio shows, a lot of they are then, and even the Rathbone and Bruce one, they're carried on the characters of the leading men. It's an interesting observation that I really haven't thought much about, but in those early radio shows, they're all down to whoever plays Holmes and Watson. Any other of that production is really just dancing around the leading men. As those shows have developed, I've listened to some of the stuff that Bert's done on the BBC, and it's a more holistic approach. It's more about the production. It's not about those two main characters. It's making the whole thing sound really good and sound really, evoking that time and that period.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? What's your thinking about Gielgud and Richardson?
It's probably some degree of heresy, but I thought they were okay. I don't know whether it's just me, because, as I say, it's about getting me at the right time. And for me, I discovered Rathbone and Bruce at the right time. So discovering Rathbone and Bruce on the radio just worked a treat for me. Anyone else is not a pale imitation, but they just don't seem to match up to it.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't think it's heresy at all. I think, to your comment, which I think is right on, about how it's all about Holmes and Watson, which is not much of a surprise, and the development of the BBC's dramatizations of Holmes and Watson, and that becoming, as you described, more holistic, I think is really right on. And I think that while I find the Gielgud and Richardson stories charming, their obvious friendship and the twinkle in the eye Sherlock Holmes that Gielgud developed as a character in a way, sort of get in the way of of what really Holmes and Watson should be all about, But on the other hand, it's lovely to listen to these fellows having such an obvious good time.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think I agree with you on that. And it's nice, isn't it? Because, these stories now are so familiar, so, have been produced so many times around the world that, there's not much you can do plot-wise or story-wise to make them stand out. So it does go back to the leading men. And I think if the cast are having fun, generally the audience have fun.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, and you have brought a lot to you've shown an interesting light on a previously unknown dark passage here, particularly with your introduction, which I think sets us up with interest for Volume 2 about what really went on and about some of these personalities. It really is fascinating, isn't it? I know in some of my own readings, I discovered a couple of years ago that Harry Allen, this has got nothing to do with these particular scripts and Leslie Charteris, but Harry Allen Towers, who was the producer of the Gielgud and Richardson series, was apparently the object of attention from the FBI or the U.S. federal government because he was believed to be connected to a Russian spy ring or a Russian prostitution ring that was operating out of some hotel in America, and as I discovered in my researches, which I hope are accurate, that he was apparently arrested and then jumped bail and went back to England.
Very true. And you know what's really interesting? I can bring that back to The Saint, because he had approached Leslie Charteris about getting the TV rights for The Saint, and they were expected to have dinner the night he was arrested.
Well, it just goes to show you that when you turn on the radio, you never know what's going on behind the scenes.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Ian Dickerson, thank you so much for talking about Sherlock Holmes, the Lost Radio Scripts with us. The book is Sherlock Holmes, the Lost Radio Scripts by Leslie Charteris and Dennis Green and Ian Dickerson. You can find it on Amazon. We will have links in the show notes. Ian's other books also available are Who is the Falcon? The Detective in Print, Movies, Radio, and TV, and The Saint on the Radio. All of it available on Amazon. Thank you so much, Ian Dickerson.
Thank you. It's been great fun.
What an interesting conversation. I felt badly during some of that because my own crazy interests and enthusiasms for things tend to drive me down connected pathways but tangents to Sherlock Holmes. But I hope our other listeners, maybe some of them sort of share a fascination with these early days of radio and how all of this works. But how interesting to It never ceases to amaze me that here it is, 2018, and we are still uncovering and discovering things we didn't know about radio programs back in the 1930s and 40s.
That's right. I think, you've got people like Ian, who are, immensely interested in this and will spare no expense or spare no effort to researching exactly what it is they want to find out. We saw that in the last episode with Julie and Sonia talking about Helene Yahasova. And really any passion that someone has that also ties in with Holmes, we are there, and we love to hear about it. And I loved Ian's suggestion that more attention needs to be lavished on Edith Meiser. And I think that's something we'll kind of put in the hopper for perhaps a future episode.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
Yeah.
And as Ian made quite clear, the idea of Sherlock Holmes on the radio, other than some of the first instances where because of his literary presence, he was brought to the radio in its early days. But the idea of Sherlock Holmes as a continuing presence on the radio seems to have been primarily Edith Meiser's.
72 years. That's how long the Baker Street Journal has been around. You know what else has been around for 72 years? Dolly Parton, Itzhak Perlman, John Lithgow. In some senses, that's not very long. After all, it's less than half of the time that Sherlock Holmes has been with us. But during that time, some of the most remarkable scholarship about the great detective has been penned. In fact, the Morley Montgomery Award for the best article in the Baker Street Journal in 2017 went to Susan E. Bailey for her article, Whitehall Palace Irregulars, Female Searchers and Suspects in 19th Century London. In it, Susan looked at the role of Mrs. Tangi in the Naval Treaty and explained just how early women were involved in unofficial police work in the 1800s. From that which we see and observe to that which may be hidden from our eyes and brains, the Baker Street Journal is always filled with material to delight. It's 2018 now, and the days begin to grow longer. What are you waiting for? Be sure to visit BakerStreetJournal.com and subscribe to this publication of 70 years today. Now, all about that contest that we promised to unleash on you. Of course, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at ihearofsherlock.com. That's our website. You can leave a comment there. We also have a page where you can find all of our contact information, which includes our email address, which is comment@ihearofsherlock.com.
Yes, you can call us. Please call us, 774. Our call center is open 24/7. Our attendants are standing by, ready for your call at 774-221-READ. That's 774-221-7323.
Oh, I like that. I like that idea. And of course, if you'd like to reach us on the socials, we are all up in the main ones, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We are I Hear of Sherlock in every single one of those. And of course, as we mentioned with the contest, you are only eligible to participate in this and perhaps win if you are a regular supporter of the show via PayPal or Patreon. We do like to reward our supporters, and at a certain level, we actually gave out gifts at the end of the year last year for folks who have been kind to us over the years. And we would love for you to be able to participate in this. All it takes, minimum requirement, is $1 per episode. That's not too much to ask, is it? But we have a contest here where the winner will receive a book or other meaningful Sherlockian tchotchke that we will send along. Just email us your answer with the subject canonical couplets. Canonical couplets. With your answer, comment at ihearofsherlock.com. That's the email address. Comment at ihearofsherlock.com. So here's how it works. We will give you a canonical couplet, a 2-line poem, and all you have to do is identify the story from which this short poem was taken, or the story that this short poem refers to. Does that work for you, Bert?
That seems to me to be eminently fair.
Excellent. Well, we will start this very first round of canonical couplets with this. You wouldn't think a prosperous old hellion could fool a clever doctor like Trevelyan. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, what story this represents, send us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. And while you are on the webs there doing that, you might leave us a rating or review on the podcast platform of your choice, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Google Play or Stitcher or SoundCloud, whatever you like. Leave us a review.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I think this is a great idea. I like this contest.
Well, we'll see how people gin to it. And speaking of gin, I need to hit the glasses. Or the bottles. I don't know which it is. I don't want to overdo it.
No.
Well, this has been lovely. Thank you once again for spending your time with I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Until next time, I am forced to be Scott Monty.
And I am pleased and proud to easily be Burt Wolder. I've had so much practice.
And we're glad you are.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.